During the 11-day Gaza war, China proved its allegiance to Iran and terror group Hamas. When Israel was defending itself from an indiscriminate barrage of rocket fire, China upped the ante on Israel in the United Nations. And the level of anti-Semitic propaganda on its state media went off the roof. China did all this to hurt Israeli interests and justify it with anti-Jewish hatred. But Israel didn't take this lying down. Israel is heading back. And with the latest development, Israel is growing in stature more than ever. And this time, it is going to hurt China's interests in Africa. Hi, and welcome to TFI Global, the foreign affairs and geopolitical analysis arm of the TFI Media Group. I am your host Shubhangi, and in this video, I will tell you how China should fear Israel's latest wins in Africa. Let's begin. After nearly 2 decades, Israel has once again entered Africa, officially so. It was in 2002 that the former Organization of African Unity dissolved itself and reconstructed what is today known as the African Union, the main political, economic, and diplomatic union of African nations. The entry of Israel into the African Union marks the end of heavy diplomatic overtures being carried out for quite some time now. Especially under the Netanyahu administration, Israel vigorously pursued enhanced diplomatic ties with as many African nations as possible. Now, the entry of Israel as an observer to the African Union could spell worries for China. China's debts and investments in the African continent have been turning sour. Chinese ambitions of colonizing the continent too, as a consequence, are taking a massive drubbing. For years now, Xi Jinping has been eyeing Africa and its resources. But the countries of the vast continent are no novices. They know when they are being prepared for exploitation. Therefore, Israel's entry as an observer to the African Union becomes all the more important, given China has been pursuing an anti-Jewish and pro-Palestine agenda since the Israel-Gaza war. Speaking about the landmark development, Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid said, "This is a day of celebration for Israel-African relations. This diplomatic achievement is the result of efforts by the Foreign Ministry, the African Division, and Israeli embassies on the continent. This corrects the anomaly that existed for almost 2 decades and is an important part of strengthening the fabric of Israel's foreign relations. This will help us strengthen our activities on the continent and in the organization's member states." Israel has diplomatic relations with 46 African Union member states. Israel re-established relations with Guinea in 2016 and with Chad in 2019. In October 2020, Israel also signed a normalization agreement with Sudan. According to the Times of Israel, in fact, in July 2016, Netanyahu became the first Israeli premier in decades to travel to the continent when he visited 4 East African nations: Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. By eyeing Africa, Israel is looking to create new markets for its agricultural produce and, of course, defense and security weapon systems as well. Africa can also benefit immensely by getting access to high-end Israeli technologies cutting across sectors. With the same in mind, in December 2016, Israel hosted 7 ministers and many top officials from over a dozen Western African countries at an agricultural conference in Israel, which was co-sponsored by the Economic Community of Western African States and Mashav, Israel's agency for international development cooperation. Israel still does not have diplomatic ties with Comoros, Djibouti, Libya, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Tunisia, Algeria, and Somalia. With all other countries of the continent, Israel either has full-fledged bilateral ties or at least functional diplomatic relations. With its induction as an observer state at the African Union, however, Israel will get direct access to the continent, which is increasingly being eyed by many powers. Jerusalem will get the chance of increasing the volume and quality of ties with African nations, and the single focus would remain on countering China. Israel's ties with Africa are continuously on the rise. Only last year, as said earlier, Israel and Sudan signed a normalization of ties agreement as a part of the larger Abraham Accords that were brokered across the Middle East and North Africa by the United States. Already, Israel has good ties with the predominantly Christian and peaceful countries of Africa. With the Arab Muslim nations as well, Israel is now looking to step up its ties. Apart from Sudan, even Morocco signed a full normalization deal with Israel last year. Egypt and Israel have a peace deal which dates back to 1979. Today, Egypt is a good friend of Israel. Africa is becoming a region of intense power play between strong powers of the world, with the United States' influence in the continent waning. Russia has been making some heavy inroads into Africa. France and Russia are themselves competing with each other for primacy in the continent. And then there is China, which is eyeing the continent's tremendous untapped resources. With its neo-colonial Belt and Road Initiative, China is not only debt-trapping many countries in Africa, but is also colonizing them with the intention of enslavement. China eyes Africa for its labor, which it considers cheap or even more horrifyingly, free of cost. However, Chinese designs have been facing remarkable resistance in Africa, with countries refusing to pay their debts to Beijing and also refusing to part with any strategic assets which China would ideally want to fill its hands with. Now that another player in the form of Israel has entered the power play in Africa, the leg room for China to play the bully will further shrink, and it will be forced to leave the continent, ashamed and defeated.